Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. I am joined by managing editor Dave Noyce, who oversees the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access transcripts of our podcast and our complete newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us up on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. When Russell M. Nelson, already the oldest ever president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, turned 100 last year, the Utah-based faith celebrated him with a televised birthday party. Utah Governor Spencer Cox declared September 9th, 2024 as the Russell M. Nelson Day. Throngs of young single adults signed a giant birthday card, and members everywhere reflected on the centenarian's accomplishments and leadership. By comparison, his 101st birthday on Tuesday was a quieter affair, as Nelson gathered with close family and friends. Still, just before the calendar marked the day, Nelson published a major essay in Time magazine extolling the importance of peacemaking in a divided world. Here to discuss Nelson's life, leadership, and legacy is Latter-day Saint historian Kathleen Flake, Bushman Professor of Mormon Studies Emerita at the University of Virginia. Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Okay, as a historian, how does Nelson's leadership compare and contrast to other LDS leaders?
Well, I think that it's most obviously the pace and energy of change under his administration is remarkable. I think you could go to any of the presidents of the church and see change, but somehow this feels, in keeping with its time possibly, to be ratcheted up a bit.
Which is not exactly what we expected from this man.
I don't know. I think it's a little more than many expected. He seemed to, I've heard some people refer to him going and kicking things out of committee, ideas that had been circulating in church administration and discussed for many years, all of a sudden were put into action. So I don't, again, I guess I'm not comfortable comparing to others, because you could look at Spencer W. Kimball. Those were years of enormous and powerful change. President Hinckley as well. So I think maybe for me, I see Mormonism as a religion that is susceptible, adaptable to change, both in the broader culture and within its own tradition. And we've certainly seen that with President Nelson. Maybe we don't expect this of a person when you think of the years in which he was born and developed and grew as a personality. We generally don't expect someone now in his late years to be so of the contemporary times.
Kathleen, that was going to be my question, actually. When Nelson took the church's reins, I think more than 7 years ago now, some predicted he would be a caretaker presidency. Instead, he's been viewed as, quote, transformative. Do you agree with that assessment, and why?
Well, I think he's transformative in a church that tends to be transformative, is what my own feeling about this. I think that President Hinckley was also a very energetic president, and most of us, I think, expect that after a period of change, you need to institutions need to get, not just a matter of get used to, you need to develop and integrate that change more fully. And so his era could have been a time of just adapting to the changes that had occurred in the late 20th century, because there was a lot of growth and change during that period as well. But instead, he has continued that, and possibly because of the structural changes he's made, maybe he's increased that change.
So let's go to a kind of a specific topic. President Nelson has denounced racism and launch this kind of collaboration with the NAACP. What do you think about that? Are you surprised at all that he did this?
Well, I'm not surprised. As I observed it from a distance, the church always looks for partners. I think that this was an area, to understate it, it was quite fraught, where it was difficult to find partners. So they found one in a conservative institution. And I think that that's understandable. The church had to prove itself, had to prove its bona fides, its the sincerity of its intentions. And I think that it was properly grateful to the NAACP to engage with it. What struck me the most about that was the way the church found areas of common interest and intention with the NAACP. When you look at what they crafted together as how they would relate, I was really impressed with that. So, for example, if you look at the fellowships they gave that are designed to increase African American identity with their roots, and you see what the church has done in terms of sponsoring those fellowships. I don't know how others who know more than I do would rate the success of those, but I thought that was an interesting ask, either on the part of the NAACP or the church volunteering. I think the way they have, for example, participated with the museum on slavery in South Carolina, where they built and maintained a genealogical service that my understanding is that it will operate in perpetuity in that museum. I thought that was something the church could do that was consistent with its own values. And then the way it worked with neighborhoods and made available its various material services and member contributions to building gardens, et cetera, et cetera. I thought all of that in terms of education, family solidarity, personal identity, those are all things that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does internally. And I saw that they crafted those things in such a way that could be a shared engagement with the NAACP. I'll say one other thing about, I was struck by how intelligently both the NAACP and the LDS Church found common ground. Instead of just throwing money at the problem, having speeches, making formal apologies, I felt they really got down to what they shared and what the church could offer. And I think that that's also merely a start. I think that what you'll see is they'll evaluate, as the LDS Church often does, they will evaluate the success of those programs and be ready to do more.
I'm going to jump to another topic now. Nelson has announced 200 of the church's 382 planned or existing temples. What do you think about this kind of temple building frenzy?
I'm not sure it's a temple frenzy. I don't know that it is a lot of growth over a short period of time. It appears to me to be well-structured growth, part of a larger strategic plan, not just throwing darts at a map. So I think they've looked very carefully at population sizes, who needs beginning at larger distances and then filling in behind. So I think it's a very strategic plan of growth. I think it shows particular concern also for sites. You don't have the temple in Nashville, Tennessee, looking like the temple in Rome. You don't show up in Rome with, unprepared, and I think they were prepared. I think that they've chosen their statement and sites very well. I think that they haven't been led by making those statements, however. I think the primary concern has been access to people who formerly didn't have access. So if you look at where the growth is, it's not just in North America, it's in Africa. Those are probably the two leading sites when I hear the announcements made where the growth is occurring. In terms of their own budget, which I know is a controversial subject in other matters, I don't think, from what you can tell, given that they don't make these numbers public, but people who have evaluated look at it about a $6 billion endeavor, moderately. They would say it'd be, between maybe $6 and $8 billion. That's not counting what's going on in Salt Lake City with the reconstruction. Don't know that anybody's tried to evaluate the cost there, but my point is, I don't think they're over their skis in terms of how they're spending on this initiative. So I don't see an economic frenzy here. I think this is something that I keep saying I think, and I must say I think because I'm not privy to any of this data, but this goes back to Howard W. Hunter. And Peggy, I can't remember what years those were, the 80s?
You mean when he was president?
Yeah, that brief time when he was president, but
Yeah, that was 1993 to
1993, something like that. So it's shocking to say that, that's 30 years ago, right? And if you look at the arc of building temples, that too, I think, shows the strategy I've been talking about. But yes, he's announced 20 temples a year. So I think a couple of years he announced 30, but 20 temples a year.
President Nelson?
Yes.
Yeah, he did like 15 and then 17 in 1 year. So it's like 32 in 1 year. So yes,
Yeah. So he ranges, there's a range, but that's a 30-year trajectory you have to put this on. And so it looks like a lot, I think, to those of us who grew up when there were only 7 temples. Right? But I think it matches. If we were to speak just in terms of business plan, I just don't think it's a frenzy. I think they're very careful in how they're doing this. And I think the primary goal is to get people within 2 hours of a temple, get their members within 2 hours of temple, wherever possible.
Okay, so speaking of the temple, the church has made multiple changes to the wording of temple rituals during his tenure, especially increasing gender equity. How do you see those changes and how do you see his general approach to women?
I think gender issues have played a part for several years in the evolution of the temple ceremony. I think rather that I don't think gender is to me the most pronounced change in that ceremony.
What do you think is?
I think that they have a generation of the church that, I want to be careful when I say this because it's a complicated thing. To me personally, I think in the last couple of generations of the church, you've seen an increasing evangelicalization of the temperament, right? The temperament of the church, the anxiety about grace, for example, notwithstanding what Latter-day Saint canonical texts say about grace, a kind of sensitivity about that, a kind of a temperamental shift, an affectional, sentimental shift in the kind of Christianity that Latter-day Saints have always expressed. I think that some people found that lacking in the temple. And so I think you see a little bit of care about that. But that happens on top of President Nelson's increasing using of New Testament language to call the church back to discipleship, the centrality of Christ, the emphasis on the power of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I think that the temple shows all of that. It really, in many ways, is a translation of the ceremony in contemporary terms, more than a change in the the operative parts, if you will, of the temple, right? Its ritual, liturgical dimensions have retained their continuity with the past. But I think what's happened is there is a linguistic shift that moderns, contemporary Latter-day Saints, especially young Latter-day Saints, will be more comfortable with, right? So you're still going to have that emphasis on covenant making, which is a legal dimension. Temples are, this is for me, given my training, what I see is a ritual and legal dimension to Mormonism expressed in its temples that was too much to the fore for contemporary Latter-day Saints. And so they've cushioned that. They've softened it, sentimentalized it some, brought in doctrinal expressions that the congregation is already familiar with, and integrated that with the less familiar terms of 19th and 20th century temple practices to make people more comfortable. And that, to me, is the greatest change. Now, part of that making comfortable has been to, as again, we've seen in our broader culture, sensitize greater sensitivity to gender distinctions. So they're obviously there, but that's not the only change.
But what, again, what would you say his approach to women has been? Again, as you say, a contemporary issue generally, let alone in the church.
Yeah, I think he has been remarkably frank in demanding that the women of the church begin to see themselves as having priestly power. So that's been one of the most, I think, striking things about his pastoral work on the issue of gender. You can see several conference talks where he has used the word plead. I plead with the sisters of the church to speak up, speak out. I plead with them to read the following sections of the Doctrine and Covenants and learn what priesthood is. He said, without qualification, men and women who go to the temple are endowed with priesthood power from on high. So I don't know how he could speak any more clearly than he has on that subject. I don't know how much that's filtered down, and I agree that there are still some structural dimensions with sexual distinctions that are being made that continue to, they deserve scrutiny. They deserve, some more. I expect some more change. He's reordered the ward structure of the church to elevate the role of the Relief Society such that certain dimensions of what were this was in the blue org chart. I don't know if people remember this, where you see the Relief Society president and the Elders Quorum president assigned to most of the Melchizedek dimensions of the ward life, whereas the bishop, as the high priest of the Aaronic priesthood, retains his responsibility for all actions in the ward, but is primarily attending to those material dimensions of the judicial dimensions, the dimensions of youth leadership, the dimensions of tithing, et cetera, welfare, all of that. But the Elders Quorum president, the Relief Society president, that reorganization was extraordinary. Now, they haven't done anything on the stake level. I don't know that they intend to, but that's the obvious next place to go, to think about how you connect the general presidencies of the women's organizations with more immediately with the body of the church. But they certainly, under his leadership, radically changed the organization of the wards.
Kathleen, I want to go to another point during his presidency, which was a real challenge, the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
Of course, Russell Nelson, famously a doctor, renowned heart surgeon. What did you think of his guidance during COVID-19?
Well, this is another place where I don't think the leadership could have been any more clear about where they stood on vaccinations. Even ultimately, having him filmed receiving a vaccination. So
Yeah, at about the first day you could get it too. Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
I was nonplussed that the Latter-day Saints who continued to rant and rave about their freedom not to be vaccinated. They certainly were free not to vaccinate. They're also free not to pay their tithing. So I don't know what they were thinking, but um, I think what strikes me, not just about COVID, but about other political issues that have strained the church, and not just our democracy, but have strained relationships in the church. I think what I see, I want to say this carefully. This is just my judgment from afar. I see them working very hard not to require members to choose between their politics and their faith. And so they will come out and they will say plainly what they think, but they are ignoring calls from either side to punish the other side. Right. So I see them trying to exemplify the lack of contention that they're calling upon their members to show. So that just generally, I think that's how they've been kind of surfing the chaos that's been going on around them, trying to in their world, put first things first. And first things are your covenants. Not that you don't have responsibilities as a citizen, but trying not to put members crossways with their covenants, even as they express their political freedoms.
So on his 100th birthday, Apostle Jeffrey R. Holland said, President Nelson's tenure has been marked by, quote, a rush of revelation. Indeed, he has used the term revelation for his changes more than any previous president. How do you think his understanding might be different from those other prophet presidents? His understanding of revelation?
I don't know that it is. I think the question...
Really use the word more.
He's used the word more, but he's also made more changes, the scope of which call upon the use of that word. When you are reorganizing the priesthood structure of the wards, you don't do that as simply a good idea. You don't do that simply as a matter of efficiency, right? When you're calling upon members of the church to change their worship habits so that you no longer go to the temple, I don't know how frequently you want to pace it, but it seems to me the assumption is it's not a bad idea to be there every week if you possibly can, right? That's a radical shift in how Latter-day Saints understand their sacramental lives, right? When you invite youth, whenever you are making the kinds of changes he's making the temple, opening it up to youth, for example, right? Not just in terms of putting 2 baptism fonts in the Salt Lake Temple and others, I understand, to encourage youth to go more, but also temple workers now. I have to say, there was one day I went and I thought, does the person who was coming this session, I thought, does his mother know he's out that late? I mean, to someone who's as old as I am, I look at some of the young people in the temple and I'm just surprised. It's all a good thing, but these are changes in a liturgical or a worship space that you don't make lightly. And so he is needed to assert the legitimacy of his authority to do that. And that word does it. So we could look at other things, but I think certainly in the temple and in those areas where there is political conflict, right? Whether it's a high-level political conflict, he invokes his authority. And the way you do that is to say, I'm not speaking with my own voice.
You mentioned earlier how the church is growing rapidly in parts of Africa and other parts of the global south. What kinds of moves have you seen Nelson make that shows his awareness of the globalness of the church and how it's increasing?
Well, the first 2 years of his administration, I think he went to over 30 nations and about 50 cities in the world. I think he's tried very hard to collapse the distance between Salt Lake City and the various stakes of the church. And that includes increasing both the number and authority of the 70s, but also the travel demands placed upon the quorum of the 12. But he himself has shouldered that burden to try to be seen both in their humanity and also their the particular charism that they believe they have in terms of their office. So I think that's one. I think that probably one of the there's so much going on that some of these things need more, I think, need a little more airtime. But I think Pathways, their educational program, has been central to their outreach and their effort to maintain their conception of Zion as where people have a oneness of heart and mind, which is a oneness of experience and a oneness of both temporal and spiritual opportunity. And so BYU Pathways, the ramping up of humanitarian services that not only through the welfare program provides for the members, but through the Humanitarian Services Project tries to lift the society around those members. You can't just benefit the individual. The church is very much communitarian, right? So you see that in their welfare program. So they seek to benefit the nations in which these members live in a way that's quite extraordinary. Speaking of partnerships that they've made around the world. So I think all of that speaks to global outreach that manifests Mormonism's characteristic refusal to not recognize the importance of the temporal to the spiritual and vice versa. You see that?
I know.
Yeah.
In his first year and a half, he famously went to countries on every continent except Antarctica, of course. That's the only place he hadn't gone to as president. What about his 3 apostle picks? They sort of reflect that too, don't you think? He chose an Asian American, a Latin American, and a European.
As the church matures, I think that is a recognition of the increasing maturity of the church in those areas. And I think you'll see more of it. So yes, I think that absolutely that was a statement of inclusion. You see it also in programs like what the Tabernacle Choir is doing, inviting individuals from other countries to come sing with them. And I think, from what I understand, you'll see more of that at the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. So they're very aware of it, and I think every arm of the church administration, educational, humanitarian services, certainly people who do its website, those people designing the website and the publication materials, et cetera, trying to use parts of Salt Lake as a staging area to highlight other parts of the church and other parts of the world, like their celebration of Cinco de Mayo and things like that. And that will increase, I assume, as the strength of the church increases.
What do you think about his move fairly early on to eliminate use of the Mormon nickname? How has it affected the church and its membership?
I think that it has made the how to say that? I think that I think that requiring Latter-day Saints to use that term, that name, has clarified for them the centrality of Christ in their own daily practice, not just their theology, not just their scriptures, but in how they move about the world, how they introduce themselves, how they tell people what their religion is. I think it's changed them. I think it's coupled also, though, with increasing emphasis in church preaching and publication about understanding themselves as disciples of Christ. Right.
Yeah. It's,
So, and I,
the church, the church has invested, Kathleen, a lot in this change, changing a lot of domain names, a lot of their messaging, a lot of
Mhm.
their, manuals, things like that. Will that legacy last? Do you think that's going to continue, or do you think that could go away?
No, I think presidents of the church have tried this for a half a century, right? This is not new with Russell Nelson. They've tried this, but President Nelson is the first one to say, "Okay, we're going to change the name of the Tabernacle Choir. We're going to have a new logo. We're going to, and so he's doing those things to ensure that it does last. If somebody wants to change it, they're going to have to undo all those institutional markers and restraints that he's put in place. So yeah, I think it's going to last. Now, how people outside the church are going to manage this, I know as a scholar, Mormonism is a term of art in the study of religion. And it is an appropriate term insofar as scholars, we look at all the various religious communities that look to Joseph Smith as their originator. The problem comes if you want to distinguish this dimension of that broader tradition and call it the Mormon Church. That's a problem. There is nothing that's called the Mormon Church out there officially, right? And
Right.
so I think that's harder for people who write about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? And people who speak about it as you do in broadcasting. And so they're going to have to negotiate that. I think that what the church has offered as a compromise is the shortened Church of Jesus Christ. I think that will work, just like we know when someone says, I'm a member of the Disciples of Christ, nobody says, hey, aren't we all disciples of Christ? So they say, oh, we know you. You descend from Alexander Campbell. Someday, I think probably in the broader publishing and scholarly world, you'll be able to say the Church of Jesus Christ, and they'll understand it, like when we say the community of Christ, or the Church of the Disciples of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. But that's going to take longer.
Although whenever we journalists talk about the community of Christ, we always have to say formerly known as. Otherwise, no one knows who that is.
That's true. And some of that has to do with their public profile.
I'm just suggesting that the same thing may, for a young one,
I think yes, absolutely. There'll be that transition period.
If you just say the Church of Jesus Christ, I would say 99.9% of people won't know who that is.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I'm saying this is something we're negotiating right now as scholarly
friends,
Yeah. So this is just this is something I struggle with in my writing. What can I use that's respectful?
World, yes, yes.
Yeah, that's respectful and legible, understandable. So no, I agree, Peggy. For a long, long time, it's going to be, AKA, otherwise known as Mormonism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. As mentioned in the intro, he's spoken several times about the importance of peacemaking, but a little bit, as you were suggesting too, mostly he's talked about it in a personal rather than political sense. Do you see that making a lasting impact on members?
Well, this is a question of conversion, isn't it, Peggy? Right, the conversion of the heart. And that's their most essential business, if you will, is calling people to repentance and to living a Christ-like life. So I don't know whether I don't know whether Latter-day Saints can act like Latter-day Saints in this regard. So far, I would say the church has, to its credit, kept this out of its congregational life in a way that I haven't seen elsewhere. So I haven't seen those divisions institutionalized. And to that extent, I think they are successful. But they have such a track record of keeping politics out of their church buildings that I think they've been helped by that. I think their lay leadership and the rotation of leadership has also helped them with that. But the rest of it is really the human heart. and whether the church can continue in the life of the Latter-day Saint to make that the primary commitment and among its members, which is to live the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I don't know what more they can do than what they're doing. And what I don't know is what they're doing behind the scenes to help their Latin American and other immigrant members. That would be an interesting question if someone could find that out. I assume that it's going on, but I assume they're going to keep it as quiet as possible so that they don't get embroiled in local United States politics or anywhere else.
So, Kathleen, the Salt Lake Temple will reopen in 2027 to much fanfare. I'm starting to wonder if President Nelson will actually be around for that occasion. He might be. What do you think?
I don't know. I am ambivalent. If I were he, I would want a release from my calling at that. But on the other hand, I think he would love to do that, and I wouldn't want to deny him that. So I'm going to leave that in the hands of his fate and his Lord. But nobody can begrudge him working up to the finish line. That's for sure.
Okay, last question, Kathleen. In your view as a historian, what do you think President Nelson will most be remembered for?
Depends on by whom, right? Who will remember him for what? I think socially, in terms of those who study Mormonism, it will be the rapid organizational change of his era, including the identity shifts, global outreach, and all the mechanisms for that he accelerated. I think he will be remembered for the wisdom of his leadership during COVID. I think the most dramatic change in the long history for insiders is going to be his articulation of temple doctrines in the church at large and making temples accessible to the majority of the church. So I think his themes of priesthood, covenant making, revelation, all those things are temple-centered doctrines in particular. And then him making these facilities, these temples available to people in a way that we could not have imagined in the 20th century. It's what he'll be remembered for.
Kathleen Flake, thank you so much for your insights today and for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.